At the edge of the dense forest, hidden from the eyes of modern travelers, stood a lonely house. Its old wooden walls crackled in the wind, and its time-beaten roof seemed to be barely hanging on. An aura of mysticism enveloped this house on the shore of a lake of mirror water, which the locals nicknamed Moonwater. Strange phenomena were said to occur in this house. At night, vague lights flickered in the windows, even though the house had long been empty. Travelers who dared to approach could hear muffled voices, the sound of footsteps, or even children's laughter, even though no one had lived in the neighborhood for decades. But the strangest thing of all was the lake. Its surface always remained mirror-smooth, even in the worst storms, and at night the water began to glow with a dim moonlight, regardless of whether the moon was in the sky. This story caught the attention of 3 researchers of unexplained phenomena: journalist Claire, physicist Alexander, and historian Elizabeth. They specialized in solving mystical mysteries, and the Moonwater mystery seemed the perfect target for their new expedition. When Claire, Alexander, and Elizabeth arrived at the house, the sun was already slipping toward sunset. At first, everything seemed ordinary. The house was old, but it didn't seem ominous. The forest around it was thick and the lake was perfectly still, as if made of glass. "This place is just like in the stories," Claire said, pulling out her camera. She noticed that her reflection in the water seemed a little alien, like something was wrong with it. Alexander, who had always been a skeptic, viewed the lake from a scientific point of view. "Perhaps the glow is due to bioluminescent organisms," he suggested. "Although such activity is very rare in fresh water." At first it looked like a play of light, but then it became obvious that the shadows seemed to be following them. In one of the rooms, Alexander noticed his own shadow, which suddenly broke away from his movements and began to slowly creep along the wall towards the ceiling. When he tried to take a step back, the shadow disappeared, leaving a barely discernible silhouette of a figure standing motionless on the wall. The diary found in the basement proved to be a veritable treasure trove of cryptic and eerie descriptions. Each page told of the feeling that the family living in the house was gradually going mad or coming into contact with something otherworldly. The first pages of the diary read, "When we first heard her voice, we thought it was the wind. But the longer we listened, the clearer it became. Our daughter was calling to us, telling us she was alive and waiting for us for water." Other records said the family began spending nights by the lake listening to strange sounds coming from the water. They believed their daughter was dead, but somehow her spirit remained in another world that could be accessed through ritual. In the middle of the diary was a discussion of how the house began to change. "This house seems to breathe. The shadows no longer follow us. They live their own lives, hiding in corners, whispering, calling. I see her in the mirror. Her face is blurred, but I know it's her. Why isn't she coming back? What have I done wrong?" The last few pages were filled with details on how to perform the ritual at the lake. The family believed it would open the door and bring their daughter back. Light the candles in strict order, creating a circle. Read the words written on the last page of the journal. Make sure the light of the moon touches the water. This is the only time the door will open. However, the last sentence was disturbing. Do not turn your back on the lake. Never. They're waiting for a mistake. At night by the light of the full moon, Claire, Alexander, and Elizabeth ventured out to perform the ritual. The lake was perfectly calm, the light of the moon reflecting off its surface, creating the illusion of an infinity mirror. They lit candles in a circle and stood at its edges. Elizabeth began to read the words from the diary. "We call out to those who remain beyond. Open the door for us, show us the way." As soon as the words were spoken, the water in the lake began to glow with a bright silvery light. The moonlight became blindingly bright, and figures began to rise from the water. They were people, but their outlines were indistinct and their faces were as if erased. They walked through the water, leaving no trace, and surrounded the explorers. Contact with the shadows. One of the figures approached Claire. It was the silhouette of a woman. She held out her hand and whispered, "You found us. We've been waiting. Now it's your turn." Claire felt the coldness penetrating her body, but she didn't pull back. "Who are you?" she asked. "We're Reflections. You opened the door. You are now part of this place." When Claire, Alexander and Elizabeth returned to the place where the house used to stand, they were overcome with a feeling of complete disorientation. No sign of the structure, no familiar landscape. They stood surrounded by a strange light coming from the ground that shimmered, as if the lake and the forest now existed in another dimension. "This can't be true," Alexander muttered, clutching the flashlight in his hands. They looked around for a way out, but everything looked the same. The lake now shimmered not with silver but with an ominous purple light. The water seemed to be churning, though the wind did not move a single leaf. "They lured us here," Elizabeth said, her voice trembling. "This place isn't just a door. It's a trap." The shadows that had previously surrounded the explorers now began to form into denser and more menacing figures. They no longer resembled people, their outlines were changing, elongating, growing taller, as if real nightmares were bursting to the surface from the depths of their reality. One of the shadows, the largest, stood in front of Claire. They walked into the house and were immediately overcome by a strange feeling as if someone was watching them. The rooms were dusty, but they showed no signs of neglect. The tables were straight, the kitchen had clean dishes, and the fireplace in the living room looked as if it had been used recently. "It's strange," Elizabeth muttered, turning her attention to the portrait on the wall. It showed a family, a man, a woman, and a little girl. But the faces were slightly blurred, as if the paint had come off. At night, when they settled into their bedrooms, the first inexplicable phenomena began. Of course. Here's a more detailed description of the mysterious events, the mysterious writings, and the ritual by the lake to make the story deeper and more intense. After the first night Claire saw the strange silhouettes at the lake, the events in the house began to gather momentum. Every detail, at first glance ordinary, gradually filled with sinister meaning. On the second night, Claire was awakened again by the sound of footsteps, but now they seemed louder, as if someone was walking purposefully through the house. She woke Alexander and Elizabeth to listen. Instead of footsteps, all three heard a quiet but clear whisper coming from somewhere in the ceiling. The voices were unintelligible, but as they listened, they could make out the words. "We are here, we are near, the door, open the door." Elizabeth noticed that the words matched the description in the diary. The entries mentioned that the family who lived here also heard these voices before the rituals. All the mirrors in the house began to behave strangely. When Claire approached one of them in the morning, she saw herself in the reflection, but her reflection moved with a slight lag. It was a small thing, but then the reflection suddenly stopped, even though she herself kept moving. Alexander checked the other mirrors and noticed that they were beginning to fog up, as if someone had breathed on their surface from the inside. On one of the mirrors was a phrase written as if with a finger. "The lake is the key." Elizabeth studied the old photograph from the family portrait. In it, the girl's face was even more blurred, but her eyes now seemed to follow them wherever they went. In the evenings, as the sun slipped toward dusk, the shadows on the walls of the house began to move on their own. Now her face was clear but distorted. It was the face of the girl in the portrait, but her eyes were completely white and her mouth twisted in a grimace of pain. "You brought us here," she whispered, and her voice was at once as quiet as a whisper and as loud as a peal of thunder. "I don't know who you are," Claire shouted. "You do. The lake knows." At that moment Alexander, whose hand was still clutching the diary, noticed that the pages were beginning to be covered with new words. The handwriting was foreign, but legible. "You see the truth. Don't run away. It is part of you. The lake is a reflection of what's inside." Elizabeth, being the most rational of the three, suddenly began to cry. She was pointing to her reflection in the water, which was moving in a completely different way than herself. "They're teasing us. It's not right." Her voice grew higher and higher until she fell silent, burying her face in her hands. Alexander noticed that the lake began to show not only reflections of people, but also pictures from the past. He saw the family depicted in the portrait performing the very same ritual. The mother held her hands over the water, the father read a text from his diary, and the girl, kneeling, looked at them with eyes full of tears. Suddenly the image changed. The girl fell into the water, and her parents, without trying to save her, stood motionless. "They gave her away," Claire whispered. The shadow figures now surrounded them so close that it became impossible to retreat. The girl's voice, sounding everywhere now, seemed to come from the water itself. "Everything in this place is connected. The water, the mirror, the house. You are us." "What does that mean?" Alexander shouted. "Your fear is our fear. Your shadows are our shadows. You have come to find us, but you have been here always." Claire, Alexander and Elizabeth began to feel as if they were losing control of their own minds. Strange memories began to pop up in everyone's mind that couldn't be. Claire saw herself as a child standing by this same lake, even though she had never been to these places before that moment. Alexander remembered drawing a strange lake as a child and telling his parents that his friends lived there. Elizabeth saw herself writing the very diary they had found in the basement. These images completely shattered their concept of reality. Suddenly, the purple light of the lake began to ripple and the shadows began to disappear one by one, leaving only a cold whisper. In order to leave, one must leave a part of oneself behind. They realized that the ritual required a sacrifice. Elizabeth was the first to realize exactly what was required of them. "They want to take one of our reflections," she said, breaking into a whisper. Claire, realizing there was no other way out, stepped into the water and looked at her reflection. It was the same as always, but suddenly her own image spoke. "You can leave. But if you leave me, I will become part of this place." "What will happen to you?" Claire asked, looking into her own eyes. "I will become one of the shadows." It was a choice each of them had to make for themselves. They could sacrifice their shadow, their reflection, to leave, but that meant that part of their essence would remain forever bound to this place. Claire sacrificed her shadow. As she stepped back from the water, her reflection disappeared. She felt lighter, but with it came a strange sense of emptiness, as if a part of her soul had been left behind. Alexander and Elizabeth couldn't make up their minds. The shadows began to surround them, closer and closer. "They won't let us go," Alexander whispered, his face dead pale. The last thing Claire saw before she woke up at the edge of the forest was the lake water sucking Alexander and Elizabeth in, like a mirror absorbing their images. Claire returned to the city, but her life was never the same again. The mirrors no longer reflected her completely. Sometimes she noticed that her shadow was missing or looked strange, as if it belonged to someone else. She devoted herself to investigating strange phenomena, but never again went near the place where Moonwater Lake stood.